Today's episode is brought to you by Charles Russell Speechlys. Charles Russell Speechlys is an international law firm with a special focus on private capital at the intersection of personal, family and business interests. With origins dating back to the 1800s, the firm has a long-standing reputation for building strong, trusted relationships with their clients. These relationships are crafted to deliver meaningful value, and like Charles Russell Speechlys, are designed to stand the test of time. In a world that is constantly changing, the steadfast, long-term relationships that Charles Russell Speechlys builds with their clients remains a constant. To learn more about their services and how they can help you, please visit www.charlesrussellspeechlys.com. Hi, I'm Violet Manners, and welcome to Hidden Heritage, the podcast that brings you inside Great Britain's favourite destinations, with help from custodians, historians, artisans, and experts. Today on Hidden Heritage, I'm joined for the first time by Molly Biddell and Katie Talbot. I'm really pleased to welcome these two fantastic guests to the podcast today. Katie Talbot is a tax, trusts and succession lawyer for Charles Russell Speechlys, an international law firm with a focus on private capital at the intersection of personal, family and business, and the sponsor of this podcast. Molly is the current head of natural capital for Knepp Estate in West Sussex. The Knepp Estate is currently developing a trailblazing 3,500-acre rewilding project that is changing the very way we think about nature and how we can heal our planet. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about it. These two incredible women join me on the podcast today, where we discuss the role of natural capital to estates and the different opportunities and challenges it can bring. We also talk about the background behind Knepp Estate's rewilding project, why it is an excellent example of safeguarding an estate's natural capital, and what the success of the project could mean for the ecological future of the UK. Molly and Katie also recommend 3 of their favourite destinations in the UK. But before that, let's get to know Molly and Katie a little bit better. Let's just start with, I guess, getting in your own words a little bit about both of yourselves, if you wouldn't mind. Katie, should we start with you?
Thanks, Violet. Yeah, so I am a solicitor and I help the owners of estates, the families, navigate the tax and legal issues that impact on their day-to-day lives. But a big part of what I do is helping them devise and implement their succession plan, which is how they can hand over their estate from one generation to the next.
Thank you. And Molly, welcome to the show. Please, share with us who you are and where you come from.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me on. It's very exciting. So I'm Molly Biddell. I'm head of natural capital at Knepp. I do that 3 days a week. So that involves working with the Knepp Estate team to understand how can we try and make the business case for nature restoration and look at emerging nature markets and where they're relevant to Knepp. And then I also work 2 days a week for my family farming business in Surrey. And that is a regenerative farm with lots of nature restoration projects on the side. So it's a mixture of different things, looking at emerging nature markets and opportunities across both of those businesses. My background before I joined Knepp and Hampton was in emerging rural policy, so post-Brexit agricultural and environmental policy. And prior to that, I studied geography at university.
Amazing. Well, such an exciting conversation ahead. And I guess for a bit of context for our listeners, I'd love to hear, just give us a brief intro into where Knepp is, what Knepp is for our listeners.
So the Knepp Estate is an estate in southwest Sussex. It's about 1,000 hectares large. It's in the low weald, so it's in between the North and the South Downs on the low weald clay. And it is known for being a rewilding experiment and project. It was a traditional family farm. It's been in the Burrell family for a very long time, hundreds of years. It's run by Charlie Burrell and his son Ned and Charlie's wife Izzy, and they run it as a rewilding project at the moment.
Yeah, and it's such a privilege to have you here and joining Katie and I because it's as you say, rightly so. It's kind of the bastion of the rewilding kind of journey that's really we're not at the beginning of, but we're certainly it's certainly becoming a sort of mainframe topic of conversation. So really excited to have you, and thank you so much for joining us. Katie, what do we mean when we say natural capital, and how is it relevant in your mind for estates?
So I think in this context, natural capital means the value attributable to or capable of being realised from the raw materials and sources of energy on an estate. So think the fields, the hills, the watercourses, the woodlands, and think harnessing the wind, the sunshine, the rain. It could mean creating new ecosystems or habitats, or creating new sources of renewable energy. So solar panels, battery storage, wind turbines. And I think for a very long time, natural capital opportunities have been largely overlooked by estates, although perhaps Knepp is the exception to the rule, partly because it was difficult to measure or monetize. There weren't that many financial incentives to actually commit to a change of land use. And dare I say it, the tax implications were either uncertain or hadn't really been fully thought through. But I think it's not just about making money. Natural capital today is actually much more about the sort of wider response to climate change, our declining biodiversity, and what it means to be a responsible landowner.
Yeah. And it presents such an exciting opportunity for estates to actually be at the forefront of this monumental role that they have to play, like we all do, but they can do so on a bigger scale potentially, towards the kind of ecological crisis that we face. Thank you. That's a really wonderful description for our listeners. And Katie, you touched on the concept of being a sort of responsible landowner, and I think, to my mind, I think estates have always been responsible. But I, as you sort of rightly point out, there's often incentives by government that make, precedents put on farming with pesticides, as it did, when we joined the EU in the 1970s. That was the sort of precedent to be farming quite aggressively with pesticides coming in from Europe, and the deals that were being done, the trade deals that were being done. So I think, this shift towards responsible land ownership, which you just touched on there. Can you explain what do you actually mean by that, and what factors do you think have driven societal changes and expectations? I kind of just touched on the EU sort of incentives, which were largely sort of trade-based in the 1970s when we joined the EU, but I'd be fascinated to know in your own words.
Thank you. I think it might help to set the scene a little bit here. So on a sort of national level, the Climate Act 2008 is the UK's approach to climate change. It's committing us by law to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to 100% of 1990 levels by 2050 to net zero. And then on a global scale, we have signed up, along with other countries, to what's known as the 30 by 30 commitment, which is a UN global framework to deliver 30% of land to nature, which is pretty ambitious, but also exciting if we could achieve it. So, and against that backdrop, I think land, and in particular agricultural land, is quite uniquely placed to be part of sort of the solution and the journey towards those objectives. Mm-hmm. Because it's both, as you touched on, a source of emissions and also can offer this tremendous opportunity for carbon offset. Mm-hmm. The government's also got behind those objectives by introducing a number of schemes. So you've got the Environmental Land Management Scheme, Sustainable Farming Incentive, which is phasing out our basic payment scheme, and Countryside Stewardship. And I think private estates, in particular, they're major landowners in the country. And I think there is an expectation that they will embrace these schemes and set their own agendas to help us in this sort of drive to achieve all those different commitments.
And Molly, can you kind of tell us, kind of Katie's just touched on contextualizing, I guess, rewilding, the shift towards farming differently, in layman's terms. Molly, could you tell us what the term rewilding really means, as you know it and understand it, and also what the origins of Knepp's rewilding project were?
Absolutely. Big question, but we can go for it.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Rewilding is a type of ecological restoration. So it's a way that you can restore nature. It's one way of doing it. And it's a real focus on letting nature lead in dictating what the landscape and habitat looks like. So it's about putting natural processes back into the landscape. And rather than saying, okay, humans are going to dictate what this landscape looks like and we're going to be solely in control of what we want it to look like, we actually go, no, let's let nature dictate what this should look like, and let's put those processes back in the landscape, and then we'll sit back and we'll watch and we'll see what happens. And that's why it's quite experimental. It's not got an outcome. You can't say we're doing a rewilding project to create X, Y, and Z, because in the very nature of doing a rewilding project, you're trying to allow wilderness to come back. You're trying to allow nature to take control and dictate what will happen. So it's a slightly radical way of looking at how we can restore our biodiversity, but it's quite beguiling because it actually turns out it's quite successful. And I think a lot of the concept of rewilding is around, where do we position ourselves as humans in relation to the planet? Do we see ourselves as something that should always be in control, or should we sometimes actually let nature kind of take back control and provide that space for nature to do its own good work? So that's rewilding. It's a form of nature restoration. And one thing I would say is it's not the answer to everything.
No.
It's not, when it comes to land management, as Katie was saying, there's so many really exciting solutions that we can deliver as land managers. I think now is the most exciting time to be farming and managing land. And rewilding isn't the answer for everything, but I think it's a really, really exciting, hopeful thing that is right in certain places and can, as we've seen at Knepp, deliver amazing results. So it's never one size fits all, but for some projects and for some places, it's a really, really exciting way to look at land management. Yep. You asked about Knepp.
Yeah.
So I'll give a quick 101 on Knepp. It's quite there are books
long
written
story.
about it.
There's lots of good books about it. Yeah.
But it is a story. I can do a quick brief overview. So Knepp, as I say, it was a traditional farming business, farming estate.
And by traditional, you mean what?
I mean, it had a bit of let land. It had an in-hand home farm, and it was being farmed as arable and dairy. Now, the key thing about Knepp is its soil type. So what you need to understand about Knepp is that it is this clay. And I've not grown up on clay. I've grown up on sand and chalk. And going and experiencing Knepp's clay is like crazy, because it genuinely is like porridge in the winter. It is so thick and sticky. Yeah. And then it turns into concrete in the summer, and you can't make even a divot with your foot. So the clay is really tricky to farm. And basically, Charlie Burrell, who's the owner, he went away to Cirencester, went to agricultural college in the 80s, learned how to farm conventionally, as you said, as we were being told how we should farm, came back, took over from his grandfather in the 80s, 90s. The farm was unsurprisingly losing money, because a lot of farms in those days were. And he said, look, Grandpa, we've just got to keep beasting the system. We've got to keep doing intensive agriculture the way that I've been taught. Let's keep going. So gave it a go, still wasn't making any money, like losing money. And partly because it's very, very hard on that kind of clay soil to achieve high yields. And you have to be achieving high yields to make a return. And we were getting low yields, so we weren't making a return. The milk marketing board crashed in 1996. And so that was suddenly all milk prices declined. So just a very classic farming story where it was hard to make money. Yeah. And Knepp was losing money. And it got to the point where Charlie and Izzy were like, right, we've got to do something completely different and radical, or we give up, because this isn't working as a business. And Charlie was also very aware that the business itself was very reliant upon the basic payment scheme. And that idea that actually can you have a farming business that's so reliant on that one government income stream? And how would you de-risk that business? So Charlie and Izzy happened to be passionate conservationists in their own kind of way, and had met this professor called Professor Franz Vera from Europe. And Franz Vera is sort of the absolute icon behind this idea of rewilding. So what Franz Vera said was, in Europe, we think that a wild landscape, if you think back to your biology lessons, we were taught that a wild landscape would be a closed cover canopy woodland, and a squirrel would be able to run from Land's End to John O'Groats on the top of the trees, and it would be like this deep forest of kind of wilderness. Franz Vera says, no, guys, you've got that wrong. That is not what wilderness would have looked like, because you're forgetting about the impact of the herbivores, those huge kind of almost like woolly mammoths, those big aurochs, those big horses, ancient herbivores that would have been roaming the landscape, and what they'd have done to the vegetation. And actually, rather than having this closed canopy woodland, you'd have had much more of a dynamic mosaic of wood pasture and open spaces where the animals had opened up the woodland, slightly more closed spaces. So anyway, he had this theory, and it's been trialed, or it's been piloted across places in Europe, which really inspired Izzy and Charlie, but it had never been done in the UK to try and recreate this wild landscape. So Izzy and Charlie thought, well, we're losing money as it is. Let's give this kind of wacky experiment a go and see what happens. We're going to do it because we think we'll not lose so much money, and also because we think it will, hopefully, fingers crossed, do something good for biodiversity. But they had no idea. It was a total experiment as to whether it would work or not. So effectively what we did at Knepp back in the late 90s, early 2000s, is we stopped farming. So over a series of 6 years, we came out of that arable and dairy production system. And then eventually we got enough funding together to put a big ring fence around the whole of Knepp. So we put a big stock fence around Knepp. And because we'd stopped farming over 6 years, all of the land that was fallow had just scrubbed up with this amazing kind of its successionary bramble scrub, thorny scrub, and these grasses that had naturally grown up in the seed bank that was in the fields already. And so once we'd had enough of a vegetation pulse, it was time to put our herbivores in the landscape. So these are our free-ranging herbivores that we want to be the proxies for that megafauna that would have been existing in a kind of wild landscape as we think it. So basically what we've got in the landscape is Tamworth pigs to replicate the impact of wild boar. We've got longhorn cattle to replicate the impact of ancient aurochs, which would have been those huge cows that would have travelled across the landscape. 3 types of deer, red, roe and fallow. And then we've also got Exmoor ponies to replicate the impact of wild horses or tarpan. So you've got this. We've also got beavers. I should have said that. So our amazing ecological engineers are little beavers. So all of these animals are in the landscape in this kind of wild, messy wilderness that's being created. And they're there to create the landscape. So they're doing their ecological engineering. They've all got very different gut biomes. They've got different mouthpieces, different shaped hooves. So they're all interacting in the land in very different ways. And Izzy and Charlie just bravely put them in the landscape and said, let's see what happens. We're now nearly 25 years later, and basically the outcome has been insane. We have now got some of the highest densities of breeding songbirds in the whole of the UK on Knepp. We've had amazing outcomes for nightingale, for turtle dove, for purple emperor butterflies, these species that are really quite rare. So life has just flown back into Knepp in a way that I don't think we'd ever have predicted. And the thing that I find the most amazing is if you were to look at a map of the UK and choose where you wanted to have a nature hotspot, you would not choose Knepp. But what's happened is just nature's flown back in such kind of, flown back, pulled back, however it wants to get back in such amazing quantities. So it's become a real biodiversity hotspot. We've also sequestered lots of carbon. We've fixed river systems. We've fixed watercourses. So we've gone from being a degraded arable and dairy farm that was losing money to an exciting rewilding project that's having amazing outcomes for biodiversity and making money.
I think that is the most mega description of Knepp ever known to man. And it's so extraordinary. I've not seen Knepp. Katie, I don't know if you have either, but it's just fascinating to hear more from in your own words. And also so exciting and so encouraging. Quickly, why would you not, if you're looking at a map of where Knepp is, why would you not expect it to be?
It's not like a designated, Natural England haven't said this is a designated special area for nature, SSSI. It's just grade 3 farmland, it's just very basic arable farmland in between the North Downs and the South Downs. So it's not an area that you would look at and go, this is definitely a priority British area for nature, but it has become one.
Okay. So Katie, your role, as you described it, is obviously advising, estates and farms on how were they to undertake quite as a dramatic, needless to say as well, Izzy and Charlie haven't met them either, but anyone that's in a fortunate position to be able to sort of just drop, farming over a period of 6 years and sort of make that kind of experiment is one thing, and they're in a category of their own in that regard to some degree. But your role is obviously advising kind of farms, estate owners on any transition that they want to make, be it to an example like Knepp or a sort of regen example. So what advice do you think you would have given to Charlie and Izzy at Knepp 25 years ago when they were starting out?
I would ask them, what is your whole estate plan? And have you thought about succession in the context of such a major decision? Because essentially achieving such a huge pivot could have implications for whether you are able to preserve, sustain and hand over your estate. I think 25 years ago it was an incredibly brave decision because we didn't have then the reassurance we have today that land managed for environmental gain can qualify for valuable inheritance tax reliefs. Because actually inheritance tax is probably one of the single biggest threats to being able to hand over the legacy that you have created. whether you're paying inheritance tax as you go along or at a sort of cliff edge event, so on the death of an owner of an estate, it's this kind of the golden thread that runs through everything. And understanding the extent to which those reliefs can apply is really important. Ultimately, it's a risk-based question. Yeah. And Charlie and Izzy were prepared to take that risk, and that's brilliant.
And I think, land management today is incredibly exciting because you can deliver these solutions, but it also, it is risky making change, whether you're moving from a conventional farming system to a regen ag system, or whether you're trying to incorporate more nature restoration. But I think that the rural sector is now at a moment in time where it's ready to kind of grasp that opportunity and actually take those risks and make those changes, because it's quite a dystopian world if we don't, and we do need to create these benefits that we can. So I think I'm seeing more and more rural businesses that are happy and excited to go, actually, yeah, we can do something great. It is a bit more risky, but let's give it a go.
And actually now it's been met with a government that's kind of forward thinking, and to both of your points, it's become a topic of conversation that it wasn't when the boroughs kind of decided to flip the switch and move to this sort of experimental way of farming their land. And I'm so grateful, Molly, that you've contextualized it for our listeners as being a not one size fits all, because I've done a huge amount of work with farmers up and down the country, and they are not in the same, they don't have the same means as the Knepp Estate, and they also don't have the kind of land, they don't have the kind of land that warrants rewilding. And I think to summarize this sort of first chapter of our conversation, I think what's really exciting and interesting to be exploring with you both today is, for our listeners, I think natural capital sits across many verticals, but the main ones being regen ag farming, to regenerative farming, I should say, rewilding. And then there's all, a litany of kind of obvious sort of various schemes in which landowners can get involved with BNG, bionet gains, and all these kind of things. But it's really, for me, in layman's terms, natural capital is about essentially diversifying land in ways that haven't been done for a very long time or before. And it's so exciting that the government are now incentivizing people to make those transitions and to your point, take the risk, because we all need to play a part. And I think, estates and landowners are kind of really wonderful at embracing change by and large. And I think it's such an exciting opportunity, as you said, Molly. So as you both know, this whole podcast is fundamentally all about also getting our guests to share their favourite places and spaces across the country, preferably historical, with a bit of a historical kind of attachment to them, but equally just places that you love, grew up in, spent time at. So much like other episodes, I'm going to be lucky enough to hear from both of you today on your favourite destinations each, and then also you'll be sharing with me at the end of the show your favourite joint destination together. So Molly, let's start with you. What's your favourite destination?
My first favourite place I've chosen is Duart Castle on Mull, because I absolutely love Scotland. I lived in Edinburgh for a bit. It is my favourite country. I'm not sure if I should say that, really, but it is.
Say that. It definitely sees itself partly as a country.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I love the West Coast. I've spent I have a camper van, so I spend a lot of time going around the West Coast in my van.
Wow.
And I also do a lot of cycling and spending lots of time going around the West Coast. And I love getting the Caledonian McBrain from Oban across to Mull. And when you come in towards Mull and you see Duart Castle, it's so spectacular. And it's also just a very beautiful place. You sort of looking out, you feel like you're able to see all of the West Coast and all of West Coast Scotland's beautiful beaches and mountains. But it's also got that lovely history of being the house of Clan MacLean, which is really exciting. And it's fun to go and look around a lovely Scottish house and feel that heritage of kind of Scotland.
So true. Mull is one of the most beautiful and arguably iconic islands on the West Coast. And who was the house of Clan MacLean?
God, that's going to be tricky. The House of Clan MacLean is the House of Clan MacLean in my head. I'm not too sure.
Okay,
sorry.
We can add.
It's just the House of Clan MacLean. That's all I know.
A Scottish clan. There are many.
A Scottish clan. It's the home of the Scottish Clan MacLean, basically. So whenever you go around, there's always the odd American trying to go back to their deepest Scottish roots, which is quite funny.
True. Thank you, Molly. So we're going to come on to present day, and Kate, it'd be really interesting to now get into, with you and Molly, discussing the myriad of challenges that exist when it comes to natural capital and the transition to a more sort of naturally based form of farming, be it the extremities of something like rewilding or a version of regenerative agricultural farming, and the many, many other things that exist within the ecosystem of natural capital. But how can estates, in your words, put nature and biodiversity on the agenda? And are there any barriers from a financial or legal perspective?
Yeah, I think ultimately putting natural capital on your agenda is going to be driven as a business decision, because whatever you do, upfront costs to implement and to manage will carry a financial cost. So I think the first step is actually really understanding what is the unique fingerprint, if you like, of your estate. What existing ecosystems and habitats and opportunities for natural capital do you have? And here, science can actually play a really exciting role. For any estate embarking on this journey, they would want to consider carrying out a habitat baseline assessment. Molly's probably better equipped to comment on the detail of those, but it's a combination of satellite imagery to actually map what you have on your estate. What is the proportion of hedgerow and watercourses and fields, and then getting in the experts, the ecologists, to look at your soil health, your humidity, your wind speeds, all of that. Carrying out a habitat baseline assessment would throw up. It gives you the facts and the figures that you need to ultimately make these business-focused decisions. But as well as sort of understanding what your fingerprint is, you also need to understand what is your vision, what is your whole estate plan, because for every estate will have a beating heart, whether it is the historic castle that sits at the heart of it, whether it's a music venue, whether it's all about its landscapes or its art collection. So understanding what is your core vision and then how natural capital can sit around that is really important.
Definitely. And Molly, can you explain what an ecological, what was Katie describing then in terms of the sort of actual practicalities of measuring the land mass and value of it?
So you're basically looking at what land are we working on here? What's our soil type? What's our geology? What's the hydrology of it? How does that work? You're taking an environmental lens, or putting your environmental glasses on and looking at your landscape through that vision. And it just throws up what opportunities there could be. And I think none of this is rocket science, right? Farms have done amazing environmental things for so long, and regenerative farming easily can be seen as something that we did 200 years ago. Mm-hmm. The difference now is that the rest of society, government, markets, policies, business are starting to actually incentivize us and reward us for delivering these environmental outcomes. So in order to tap into these emerging nature markets or environmental opportunities, you need to begin by doing this habitat baseline and understanding what you're actually working with.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also because sometimes it may be that you don't need to create a new habitat or a new ecosystem.
No, absolutely not.
What you actually need to do is manage the natural resources that you have in a different way.
Yeah. Better, or just increase their condition, or lots and lots of estates and farms have the most amazing natural capital already. They're working from a fantastic natural capital baseline. Yeah. And it's just about, okay, could we make it better? Could we reprioritize? Could we shift the little tweaks we could make?
Really interesting. And so, Katie, I guess, what kind of practical advice would you give estates looking at renewable opportunities like solar panel or battery storage or wind turbines? Because they're also all part of the kind of umbrella term of natural capital.
Yeah, absolutely. I think first of all, it's understanding that these are long-term commitments. So you may not have sold your land, but you have relinquished control over it if you are going to be installing a solar farm or erecting wind turbines or routing cables under your farmland to take wind power from the sea and allow connection to the local grid. Mm-hmm. So you really need to understand the nuts and bolts of actually what you are committing to, what are your responsibilities, and what is the cost benefit of what you are delivering. You need to understand the planning rules and the planning process, because actually that can create lots of traps for the unwary. Planning can be quite expensive. And I think there's a bit of a legacy of planning being quite reactive and not proactive when considering natural capital infrastructure in particular. And the third thing is they're not often natural, renewable energy opportunities are not pretty. Siting solar panels in fields and putting up wind turbines. And actually that leads to a really good example of an estate I recently worked with. they had the challenge of needing to raise some urgent capital to repair the roof to the mansion house. They were really stuck on how to raise this money. And then they had an opportunity to consider entering into a collaboration with a third party to install a solar park. So that could really solve that issue. But one of the family members was incredibly upset about this because the location of this solar farm, it could be seen from the windows of the great mansion house. So it was potentially destroying the beautiful view. So they were very upset about it. But a solution was found in that the family decided to use some of the sign-up fee to plant trees and create this incredible, we called it a habitat corridor.
Amazing.
And actually that then led to a wider conversation about where else could we put habitat corridors and new tree planting across the estate.
And what is a habitat corridor for our listeners?
It's basically creating like a new mini ecosystem. So planting a new hedgerow is a perfect example. So that was a great example of how renewable energy had solved a sort of a funding challenge for the estate and at the same time led to the creation of new biodiversity value for the estate. And it's actually now had a bit of a ripple effect because having looked at creating this tree line and habitat corridor here, we're now looking at where else on the estate it could be achieved.
That's really exciting.
Yeah, no, it's really excited. And it all started from a family member who led us all to think a bit more creatively.
Yeah, so interesting. And also I love that sense of there being this ecosystem because, of course, I mean, you said it at the beginning, Molly, but the transition that Knepp made and many other places are attempting to is about understanding our relationship with nature, I think is what you said at the beginning. And I think I love this idea that actually there's an ecosystem that sort of wraps around these historic places and spaces that we hold and prescribe value to because they are tourism destinations in this day and age. They hold such historical significance and importance and value. But equally, they've also got a role to play, and their role is actually what can they do for the broader conversation, the broader issue, problem, challenge shared as it relates to our ecology. But also the ecology can, in that instance, Katie, that can also like feed into restoring the roof of a historic place that we don't want to be lost, kind of thing. So that's really exciting. And how do desires to deliver nature-based solutions impact on succession planning?
Tax plays a big part in all decisions relating to both the management and the succession plan for an estate. Because if you can't fund the inheritance tax, you risk losing your estate on a generational change. And the only way one of the key ways of mitigating inheritance tax is being able to qualify for various inheritance tax reliefs and exemptions. So understanding how pivoting land or achieving a change of land use can impact on those reliefs is really important. So I think it has been a bit of a blocker for many to sort of embark on nature-based solutions because there's been this uncertainty as to whether those reliefs would be available. Because for many, the sense of being a responsible custodian often outweighs the sense of being a responsible landowner, because many of these estates have been handed down through generations of a family, and that ability to pass on that legacy is so crucial. So you don't want to do anything that could destabilize that process.
So true. So true. And Molly, coming back to you, because, frankly, there's so much that I can't wait to get into with you. But I think to sort of, again, contextualize what we're talking about for our listener as much as possible, there's a kind of common criticism that even I've had and held of rewilding, what is it about rewilding? Is it putting at risk our food production? And is it sort of essentially saying, let's sort of take all the land back and allow animals to run wild over it and bushes to grow and it to become, I think you said messy earlier when you were talking about Knepp. What's your answer to that kind of question that you must get asked a lot?
Yeah, I get it. Asked it all the time, and it's my favourite question because I actually think it's really easy to debunk. And I think it's quite easy for us to get caught up in this idea of either or. It has to be space for nature or space for food.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely not the case. So I have 3 really simple ways to debunk it. number one, the biggest risk to food production across our whole planet is ecosystem degradation. And farmers are experiencing that so much more. Like we're experiencing that on the farm that I work on. Drought is meaning that we're seriously reducing our crop yields. The risk of flood, the risk of wildfire, it's all hitting. Farmers are at the front line of the realities of what the climate and biodiversity crisis is doing to our land and our ability to produce food. So actually, if we can be working on these projects to restore ecosystems, then we'll make sure that we can continue to produce food going forward in the future. So at Knepp, we're always saying that nature restoration, ecosystem restoration is the natural ally to food production. We actually have a regenerative farm at Knepp that works alongside the Rewilding project. So just to demonstrate, we also have a market garden to demonstrate that, this is all part of a broader picture around what resilient, healthy, functioning land looks like. So firstly, nature degradation is the biggest risk to food production. Secondly, we waste in the UK a third of the food that we produce. So I would argue we do not have a production problem. We have a distribution disaster. So food, we're producing enough, the stats, we're producing enough food to feed the world easily, but it's just that food is not getting to the right people and it's being wasted in the wrong ways. So there's a lot that we can do to increase the efficiencies of our system, particularly if we do want to solve climate change and the biodiversity crisis, because the way that we're currently producing food is exacerbating those problems. So we really need to look at not just how much we're producing, but then where that produced food goes and how it's used. So distribution, really important. Food waste, really important. And then finally, I think there's a really big piece here around nutrition and diets. And like, what do we actually mean by good food? We all say, what about food production? Or what is food production? Quite often you look out at a field of grain, brilliant field of grain. There's a very high chance that grain isn't going into whiskey or beer or something that isn't high nutritious food. So it could be going into an ultra-processed food. That's not the problem of a farmer. But I think there's a whole piece as well around actually the crops that we're producing, are they going into the right kinds of nutritious calories that we need, not just going into easy access calories that actually make us incredibly unhealthy. So the whole food system is very broken, but I see projects like Knepp as a really brilliant example of ways that we can rethink how we're managing our land, what we're delivering from our land, and how can we make sure that we do better from the land that we're managing? How can we produce nutritious, sustainable calories, better levels of biodiversity, more carbon sequestration, better water courses? There's so much work for us to do because we really can deliver all of these things, but they all come together. It's not either or, it's and more, basically.
Yeah. And I think that kind of just goes back quite nicely, like to your earliest point about and Katie, it must be the same for you. Like you would never advise one client with one type of estate in the north of Scotland and sort of look to give them the same advice that you give them, based on somewhere down in Cornwall. I mean, it's just like it's day and night. And actually, I think Rewilding's worked against the odds. It's worked really well at Knepp, where it is in the country, with the clay soil. And I grew up on clay, so I know it very well. But equally, it wouldn't necessarily work everywhere else. And I think that's the beauty of this country, is whenever you travel around it, you can be struck by, particularly around sort of Leicestershire, Lincolnshire, Northamptonshire, there's plenty of hedgerows, there's plenty of sort of forestry in and amongst the sort of patchwork, quilt-like fields. But then around you now down at Knepp as well, it's wilder, it's more rugged, it's kind of, so I think that's the beauty of this country, is that there's so much opportunity because everywhere is so different.
And it makes it so much more interesting, right? And I think from what we like to share at Knepp is we were kind of brave enough to challenge what good land management looked like and go, actually, we think we can do it a different way. And that different way has proved amazing. And so I think we all have to be ready to be really open-minded and think about how we deliver solutions together and think outside the box. It's very easy because farming is tricky, right? Like it's hard to make the margins, it's hard to make it stack up. So land management in general, it's long-term thinking, and the business case for it is quite hard to make sometimes. So that means we're quite adverse to changing systems. But actually, if we can be brave enough to say, hold on, let's rethink about how we're doing this. Are there pockets that we could deliver a bit more habitat? Should we be thinking about moving to a more regenerative system? Then it becomes really, really exciting. And absolutely, it is not, one size fits all. We hope that people are inspired and motivated by our story at Knepp, and excited to kind of learn from the principles that we've learned. And we also say, like, learn from our mistakes. You know, we're not perfect. No one's going to get this perfect or right. So you've got to be prepared to make mistakes, to challenge what you think is right, and just give it a go, really.
Yeah. And I think what's so interesting about Knepp as well, it's become a tourism attraction. So it's become this like rewilding safari experience, to my understanding. And I think how do you guys go about balancing the kind of human visitors with the need to maintain this sort of, you know, throngs of birdsong and like this, you know, this nature?
Yeah, good question. So Knepp's ecotourism business comprises of wildlife safaris. So we do 500 of those a year.
Wow.
And we've got a glamping setup, we've got a campsite, and we've just got a new, beautiful, amazing kind of field, or I guess it's more like wood pasture to plate, cafe, restaurant and shop. So we've got a few different things going on. We're also in one of the most crowded areas of the UK, being in the southeast of England. So lots and lots of people. And that ecotourism side to Knepp is really, really key to its business case. Yeah, it's really important. So it's the biodiversity project, the rewilding project is central, and then the ecotourism is something that supports that biodiversity project. So for us, people are key to our rewilding story. And quite often, it's assumed that rewilding means you're like banishing all people, but you're really not doing that. We've got to bring people with us. We've got to inspire people. We've got to engage young people. We've got to, you know, like the kids at school right now, they are the people that are going to get us out of the climate and biodiversity crisis. And if they can't access places like Knepp and learn and get really excited about what we're doing, then there's no point really doing it, you know? So I like to say that rewilding is also about repeopling. It's about connecting people to nature. It's about inspiring them. And it's about showing them that we can make the business case for nature restoration. We can make the business case for regenerative agriculture and better management of land. So people are key. And it's really important that we engage people as much as possible. We're doing that in loads of different ways. We've got amazing, like, fantastic volunteer team at Knepp. Got lots of school visits. We have a whole kind of wilder education side to Knepp as well. That's not to say it doesn't come with its conflicts. I like dogs, dog walkers, animals, you know, and we have a very disconnected urban public by no one's fault. It's just what we have now. And so, again, that's where, when you've got a disconnected public, therefore, engaging people is the answer. We can't shut people out. We've got to bring them with us, and we've got to make things really accessible, make them really exciting.
And get them really excited about, like,
definitely
why it matters, why everything we're talking about today matters, basically. And I think, you know, Knepp's a very now well-known example of a success, like a success story, which is inspiring. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. That was so interesting. And now, Katie, we're going to come to you. We've heard Molly's favourite destination, but we would just love to come to you and now hear yours.
Oh, mine's an easy one. Mine is Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire. It's very close to home for me. I have been visiting Sudeley since I was a little girl with my mum and dad and with my grannies. I've got very special memories, particularly with my granny. And now I take my two boys, who are 9 and 12. So it's an incredible historic castle with all that comes with that. Queen Catherine Parr is buried in the chapel in the historic gardens. Within the gardens, there's this incredible yew tree hedge, which I think children for the last sort of 30, 40 years have been using as a maze and running in and out of it. It's tremendous fun to play in.
And it's so close to Cheltenham as well. So it's so easy to get to and sort of explore and discover. Oh my gosh, I love Sudeley as well. So that's so cool. I think we're right in saying it's the only queen of our country to ever be buried outside of a royal palace or cathedral, which is kind of cool kind of tidbit.
What's really exciting about Sudeley as well is a couple of years ago, they launched this coexistence project where they were very much putting nature and our endangered species across the world onto their agenda. So a couple of years ago, they had a herd of elephants, sort of statues of elephants sited within the grounds. So it was like a pilgrimage is the wrong word.
Like an exhibition almost.
Yeah. And then this year they've got their a safari. But all these models of animals are made from natural resources, so plants and flowers and fauna. And it's just this incredible platform for putting biodiversity and, you know, all the challenges of our declining biodiversity on the agenda, particularly for children.
Yeah, because it visually is so beautifully done at Sudeley.
Yes. So you've got enormous, like, polar bears sighted next to the lake, and you've got a woolly mammoth, within the trees in the historic parkland. It's a very special place.
Yeah, very special. And you're right, they're doing so much to kind of put quite big subjects on sort of, I guess, families' agendas, which is great. And they're doing it in a way that's inviting as opposed to being or feeling like a lecture, which is, I think, key to this, to any topic related to natural capital and many, many, many other things. Amazing. Well, thank you for that. This is just a quick reminder. You're listening to Hidden Heritage with me, Violet Manners. It's been a great conversation with Molly and Katie so far. We've explored what natural capital means for estates and the background behind the Knepp Estate's Rewilding project, some of the challenges it faces today, and how custodians need to understand the role of tax and succession planning to ameliorate risks. But now let's move on to the future. So we've learned about what natural capital can offer estates and wider community, as well as the background behind Knepp's revolutionary Rewilding project, the animals that have been reintroduced, and the positive impact it's had on the environment, the present day challenges, and we've had fantastic destination recommendations from each of our guests. But now let's move on to the future. I think, Molly, by all accounts, by the sounds of it, Knepp would never have thought 25 years ago that it was going to become what it's become. And I think we probably all would agree we don't have a mystic sort of bowl in front of us. But needless to say, there's so much happening in this space, and there's such an exciting sort of future ahead for land management and how one can diversify it and make it really not just work for the families, but also, more importantly, in some aspects, work actually for the sort of environment and ecological kind of crisis that we have at our doorstep. So, Katie, are there any other examples that you can give us about how estates can leverage natural capital for future sustainability?
Yeah, and we've touched on this already, actually. Estates can either create new ecosystems and habitats or enhance the value of what they have got to create biodiversity value or biodiversity net gain, BNG. So BNG is an approach to development. It seeks to ensure that when development takes place, habitats for nature are left in a better state than before the development. BNG became mandatory this year. And I mean, there's a whole myriad of rules and regulations, but crudely, developers are expected to deliver biodiversity net gain of 10% for any new development.
And that could be one house, that could be 30,000 houses. You have to be able to offset. Yeah.
There are thresholds.
Yeah.
So I'm really talking here about major housing developments, that would impact on landscapes. And developers have got options here as to how they can deliver that 10%. So they can do it themselves by creating habitats within the schematics that they are devising for development. But as you can imagine, like trying to achieve that in urban areas can be really tricky. And also BNG it involves a commitment. It's a 30-year commitment to manage your land or, create habitats for nature. So instead of developers creating these habitats themselves, they can also look to pay other landowners to deliver and manage habitats for nature instead. And there's a third catch-all: you can buy credits from the government. But here, estates are really quite uniquely placed to help generate and sell these credits to market. And so it's a tremendous opportunity for estates, but it comes with quite a lot of challenges because, as I touched on, these are long-term commitments. They all have to be underpinned by a habitat management plan, typically for 30 years. Some estates are doing this themselves, so they're self-funding and operating the schemes and selling the credits. But for many, actually, they look to share the risks and rewards with third parties, such as the Environment Bank. So there's lots of different options to consider. I think one of the challenges at the minute is we don't really have a unified set of documentation to govern the terms of these agreements. So there's lots of sort of pitfalls and traps for the unwary, if you like. So you really need to understand what you're signing up to, because they carry all these responsibilities, and given the sort of long-term nature of them, you need to understand what it's going to mean for you in 5 years, 10 years, and 30 years when you come out. But the upshot is it's a tremendous opportunity for those estates that can get involved.
Yeah, so true. And Molly, in your experience, how can estates create habitat banks that and find out whether their land is suitable for BNG, let's say, opportunities?
Yeah. So I'm delivering 2 habitat banks at the moment across the businesses I work with, biodiversity net gain habitat banks. It's a complex process. And absolutely, I agree with Katie. It's an opportunity for the right business in the right place with the right kind of landscape. Huge opportunity. Suddenly it's really exciting because for the first time in forever, there is a revenue stream for delivering nature restoration, right? And it means that nature doesn't just need to be funded by like goodwill or charity or government funding. Actually, people are ready to pay for biodiversity, which is amazing. The actual process of creating a habitat bank takes time. And as Katie said, there aren't many standard ways to do it yet. So we're all sort of the early movers in the marketplace. We're all talking to each other and trying to work out how we do this and how we make sure that it does end up being a high integrity marketplace that works well and you can trust in. You have to get your habitat management monitoring plan. You have to legally secure your land for biodiversity for 30 years. And then you have to work out what the taxation implications of that are like, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a lengthy process. It's not for everyone, but I think for the right people in the right place, huge opportunity. I suppose the other thing I would just add to it is biodiversity net gain, BNG, is like a very, very small marketplace in the space of emerging markets, nature markets. So it's a regulated marketplace. The only buyers are developers. It's only relevant in England, which does make it a really good opportunity in some places. But there's much more than just BNG out there. There's carbon markets, there's biodiversity markets, more generally global biodiversity voluntary markets. There's nutrient neutrality, there's water credit markets. So it's fascinating. And this is what I spend most of my time doing, is looking at these emerging nature markets that could be for lots of different things, not just for biodiversity net gain. And how can we make the business case for delivering ecosystem restoration and therefore delivering revenues for the ecosystem services, biodiversity, carbon, water that are coming off landscapes.
I see. So when you say market, so like the water one that you just gave an example, what does that actually mean? So with BNG, as you said, that's property developers in large part buying essentially, ownership, a lease of a 30-year lease on land to offset their developments. But with the other examples you just listed out there, are they kind of similar in the like approach?
Yeah, they've all got different drivers.
Yeah.
So some of them might be driven by net zero regulation. Some of them might be driven by a company making a biodiversity positive commitment, or it could be a company that has a really large water footprint because maybe it's a tech-based company and they've got loads of data centers and they're using lots of water to cool those data centers. And they might have made an environmental commitment that says we're going to reduce our environmental impact by X, Y, Z. And they realize that to do that, they need to invest in better water systems, and they need to pay people on the land to make changes, or they need to buy credits to offset the impact that they're making. I've been working in this space for 5 years. It's complex. There are loads of drivers. There's lots of different markets. They're domestic, they're international, they're voluntary, they're compliance. It's really complicated, but fundamentally it's really exciting because what it is it's society going, oh my God, we actually need to pay for the things that we're destroying rather than continue to destroy them. And that is at the heart of natural capital. That's what natural capital is about. It's about going, actually, land delivers these amazing environmental benefits or ecosystem services. How do we make us do more of that? Well, we need to make the business case for it. We can't just expect people to do it for free. We need to say, as society, we want to pay for more of that. So BNG is a great thing. I'm spending a lot of time working on it at the moment. And it's an exciting first step in the world of nature markets for the UK, particularly England. If we can make it work and we can get developers genuinely paying for really good nature restoration, either on-site or off-site, then that's really exciting. And then we can just scale that and continue to grow nature markets.
Because I guess integrity is like the key word in all of it. Because like
100%.
I imagine in any sort of new market, there's always going to be, to some degree, those that like to sort of poke around the edges and not actually do it with real integrity. So I imagine that's the kind of next few years is going to be actually making sure, to your point, that it's done with integrity at its core, as opposed to any greenwashing that might go on.
Yeah. And what I would just say to that is the UK is definitely positioning itself as a high integrity nature market. When you're working from the project developer perspective, which I am, you're like, well, this is definitely high integrity because we're trying to do it. I think the one thing that's different about this marketplace is we're trying to use markets to save the planet. So the outcome is better ecosystems and more resilience. We're not trying to use it just to make money. So that's kind of the bit that, like, you're not just creating another product for the sake of making money. You're trying to use capitalism and the economic system to fund nature restoration or to fund better resilient landscapes. But you're so right. Greenwashing, like the whole thing around green hushing and not people not doing stuff because they're so nervous of being criticized for greenwashing. So that's actually becoming a barrier in itself. And so I think that's where tech and data comes in. And as we can get much better transparency around what we're doing, because we can share things through, continual online systems and things, it does make a huge difference. So.
Yeah. And you touched on it briefly a little bit, but how do you see sort of Knepp's role? I mean, it's not like Knepp isn't like a business that you can kind of flat pack and like franchise and sort of roll out to other people. But do you see Knepp having a role in the kind of evolving model of natural capital more broadly?
Absolutely. So it's funny you say you can't flat pack it. You can't flat pack it, but it is being rolled out more broadly. So we've got our sister company, which is called Nattergal, which I work closely with. Nattergal, amazing investment-backed company that is essentially trying to prove the investment case for nature restoration. So what Nattergal's done is they've got a team of about 14 great people there, and they have bought 3 sites at the moment in the UK, and they're replicating the principles that we've learned at Knepp across those landscapes. But as we've touched on lots, like they're not going to create mini Knepps because, they're different landscapes, they're different soil types. And the way that Nattergal works is that the revenue that will be paid, the investors have invested in it and they'll get a return from that investment based upon the sale of ecosystem services embedded with ecotourism. So it's trying to prove that actually the model that we've created at Knepp plus nature market money is scalable and you can put it across the rest of the UK. So that's really exciting. So you've got Nattergal. And then the other thing to mention, we've got Wheeled to Waves, which is our nature corridor, which has spanned from Knepp. It's a 100-mile nature recovery corridor, and it connects the ancient Ashdown Forest, which is actually where Winnie the Pooh was written or based upon. So it connects the Ashdown Forest with the Sussex coast and, importantly, the Sussex Bay kelp forest. So it's like connecting this ancient terrestrial forest with this marine forest, which is beautiful. And it's a 100-mile nature restoration corridor. So it's about connectivity. We're in a very fragmented area of land, as I've said, in the southeast. It's about connecting up initiatives that are trying to do good things for the planet and do good things for the environment. But it's not just about nature. It's also about people. And it's about, what does sustainable tourism look like? What does sustainable recreation look like? How do we bring volunteers into the landscape? How do we engage and educate people? It's a really big entity. And then my role within that is to understand, okay, and where does green finance and nature markets play in a 100-mile nature recovery corridor? So there's a lot that's going on at Knepp that's kind of scaling and building on, I guess, the real buzz and excitement that's been created around Knepp.
Yeah, that's so exciting. And Katie, in your view, how can legal frameworks evolve better to support the integration of nature-based solutions and management of places like Knepp and many, many others?
I think, as we've touched on in our conversations already, there are so many competing demands on land use. You've got housing, food production, transport, watercourses, trying to avoid flooding, addressing our declining biodiversity, climate change. I mean, the list is endless. And actually, as a landowner, trying to weigh up what value to ascribe to those, particularly when ultimately you need a business case to be able to commit your estate to a change, is really difficult. And the UK government has actually sort of woken up and recognised that. And we are awaiting the publication of a land use framework for England. And there is similar planned for Scotland and Wales, I understand, which hopefully will help us sort of navigate what weight to put on all those different objectives, but on a sort of a national scale. So think of it, like a habitat baseline assessment for a state. This is a sort of habitat baseline assessment for the country. So I think, and although regulation is more regulation and rules is never to be welcomed, I think actually that could be really constructive. It remains to be seen whether that'll actually go as far as mapping where we might see renewable energy infrastructure being identified across the country. So it really informs into our planning processes. Because I think at the minute, and I touched on it earlier, the process of applying for planning permission to actually implement change, both at land management level and for, major new projects, is quite clunky. And there's lots of clashes between sort of the natural capital objectives and, transport, housing, the sort of more granular issues. So that would be really helpful if we saw it come to fruition. I think we also need a bit more clarity on the tax treatment of using land for nature-based solutions, because although the government has given us an amount of reassurance, we still don't have a lot of detail. And we have got a change of government. We've got a budget on the 30th of October. And although we've seen tremendous impetus from government behind, introducing all these new financial incentives and our land use framework, and, there's a real tide of positivity behind it all, actually, we don't quite know what's going to happen at the end of October and what new rules are going to come in. And also, major claims for inheritance tax reliefs on these schemes. We haven't had many of those properly road tested. So I think greater clarity is what's really needed to help estates put nature on their agenda firmly, to form part of their whole estate plan, and to really drive forward into the future.
Yeah, because I guess it's just been such a seismic shift, even in terminology. I mean, the fact that, Molly and you, Katie, have both mentioned ecological services, which again, 20 years ago, no one would have referred to land as being of service to us, even though, of course, it always has been. And it might be me picking up on semantics, but it's kind of, it's fun. There's a fundamental mental shift that's happened on a broad sort of scale, but predominantly it's happening at the heart of, in this country at least, with owners of, big acreage, small acreage, because it's the future, and it's also so required because they do have a fundamental and long-standing role to play in the environmental crisis that we all face. So, but it's just so interesting to hear you both using terminologies like ecological services, environmental services, land service, all of those kind of things we just wouldn't have said 10 years ago, I don't think. Okay, so Molly, our listeners are probably, we've tried to sort of simplify what natural capital is as much as possible. And I also think for people with land, be it a small acreage or a large one, how on earth do you go about sort of deciphering what you should do? Because as Katie's just said, it's complex and there's not kind of, the government aren't leading here. And in my mind, nor should they be. They should be really listening to experts like yourself that really know all about land on the ground at a grassroots level and how to apply different theologies to it. But where do you start when you're looking at what you want to do or could do in the future with your land?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Violet. And it's daunting, right? Like, it's right now, being a land manager, you've got really exciting opportunities. You've got a lot of risk, a lot of unknowns, a lot of things to negotiate and try and kind of work through. I think it also depends whether you're feeling positive or slightly overwhelmed by it all. If you're kind of a glass half full land manager or farmer, you might be thinking, oh my God, the world's literally my oyster. I've got all these amazing opportunities to deliver. I often use the phrase, within this space, we've got the solutions at our fingertips. Like, we know how to deliver exciting nature-based solutions that can fix the planet. We just need to start making the business case for it. And I think, as you said, Violet, like, a lot of it comes back down to our own responsibility. And like, we need to be market makers, not market takers, because those markets aren't quite there to take yet. So we've got to do that creativity and create the opportunities and make sure that we're creating a kind of land management system that we want and that we can be proud of. If you're positive, I think if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by it all, ask questions, go and find out about things. One of my big bugbears, and you touched on it a little bit, there is so much jargon in this space, so many buzzwords flying around the place. We haven't helped. We've added some more today. But usually if I'm presenting or talking about things, the first thing I do is I have a definition slide, and I'm like, right, don't be afraid to ask stupid questions, because so many people will pretend they know what they're talking about and they don't have a clue. So always ask, like, what do you actually mean? What does that look like? And what does that look like on the ground? And how does that actually work? And I think by asking those really nitty gritty, transparent, true questions, and then bringing a kind of positive, open-minded attitude to it, there are some really exciting things ahead. But one thing I would say is it's a huge opportunity being a land manager right now, and it's really exciting. And I get really excited by the kind of huge amount of young, dynamic, passionate people I see emerging in this space and wanting to work in this space. It's also a flippin' huge responsibility. Like, it really is. You're not only responsible for trying to make a business case from the land, but you've also got to think, well, what's the best thing for the environment? What's the best thing for my local community? You know, what can we do? So it's hard work, and I think we shouldn't overlook that. You know, it's not easy, but it can be incredibly rewarding and amazing to know that we have got the solutions at our fingertips and we can deliver the solutions that society needs.
Yeah. And also I guess, you know, working with anything land-based, working with nature. So fundamentally, whilst you guys, you know, Katie, you're advising, you know, the families and the people that are running these farms and estates on what they should do, how they need to structure things, thinking about the legacy of, you know, what they've created or want to create. And obviously you, Molly, are putting sort of the fundamental building blocks in place to like make the shape shift happen. Like, ultimately, nature dictates how quickly things happen or don't. It's not like any other sector. It's like you're working with the timeline of nature. So it's a kind of, I don't know, I love that Chinese proverb. And I think this is so acutely kind of summarizes any estate or landowner perfectly. Like, no one plants a tree to sit under the shade of it. Like, everyone plants it and takes a sort of long-term view. And I think it's just been really interesting to hear from you both today. You know, to my mind, it's about preservation, innovation, Katie, with everything that you do here at Charles Russell Speechlys. And then I think, Molly, you know, you're the kind of future focused, like, you know, innovator working with these estates. So it's just been so enlightening to like learn about the work that you guys do in tandem to support families, places, spaces, landscapes that are wanting to change and like make a really big impact on our future. So thank you so much for sharing so much with us today. It's been really, really, really interesting. And on that note, you promised us earlier in the conversation that you would share a location, a destination that you both love in equal measure. So where is that and what is it?
Right, so we have decided jointly. Well, actually, I suggested it. Katie said, I love that too.
Oh, really?
So, unsurprisingly, because it's me, I've gone for an outdoor location because that's kind of, I spend most of my time outside. It's the Purbeck Coast. I was actually there this weekend camping, which was great. So it's that Dorset coast, Dorset coast, the Isle of Purbeck. So you're right, you're just to the west of Poole Harbour, in between Poole Harbour and Lyme Regis. And you've got like Swanage and Studland and Kimmeridge Bay and Pineham. You've got Lulworth Cove. It's a geographer's heaven. It's the Jurassic coast. So it's you've got kind of fossils like Mary Anning, stories of finding fossils along that coast. It's very beautiful, and it's very beautiful farmland. It's got amazing nature. It's got heathland, it's got chalk downland, and you've got the coast. So you've got lots of salt marsh habitat and things like that. It's really diverse, really, really beautiful. And it has got some beautiful historical, it's got Lulworth Castle. Yeah. It's got Clavel Tower, which is a Landmark Trust property. It's beautiful. So I love it. I love exploring it.
What do you love about it, Katie?
Well, I discovered Ringstead Bay for the first time last summer. I mean, I think for me, the Jurassic Coast just keeps on giving. Like, you know, huge swathes of it are World Heritage Site, which sort of speaks volumes. But yeah, Ringstead Bay, you sort of go from rolling fields just into coastland and the sea, and just those vistas, and just really feeling like you're connecting back with nature.
Good swimming spots as well.
Oh, no, I didn't.
Did you not swim?
No,
too cold.
I was going to say Durdle Door, swimming round Durdle Door. Very beautiful.
No, I did the walk from Lulworth Cove to Durdle Door though.
Oh,
in
did
February.
You? How long if our listeners were wanting to do something similar, how long does it take to do that walk?
We did it in a morning, but I have two boys who just kept scrabbling up the kind of cliff, and so it wasn't the most relaxing walk, but the views were absolutely stunning.
A couple of hours.
So yeah, a couple of hours.
Minus two boys.
Minus two boys.
Oh, thank you both so much for sharing what is so clearly a passion for you both. And I know you both do this as work, but I get the sense that you'd be doing a version of what you do in your own time, spare time as well, because it's clearly a passion that you both share in your own ways. And I think, Molly, it'd be really wonderful for our listeners to know about where they could go to find out more about you and follow you, because I know you do so much public speaking around this subject, and that'd be really great to share with our listeners.
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram and I'm on LinkedIn for anyone who's in the worky world. And I suppose the way to find out more about Knepp as well would be head to the website. If you've not been on a Knepp safari is amazing. You get
Do they happen all year round, or did they happen?
They happen from April to October, and then you get access to expert ecologists, and you learn so much. I went on one the other week and I learned so much more. It's amazing.
Really?
And then the shop and the beautiful restaurant and cafe, which, as I said, only opened last year, that's open all year round, and it's a really, really lovely place to go, and you can go and explore the Knepp wildland at the same time. So brilliant, lots of opportunities.
Cool. Yeah, I will definitely make sure we share that. Well, thank you both so much. And Katie, can you be followed on any social media? I know it's different. It's a very different thing with a lawyer, so probably not. But I know, Charles Russell Speechlys has been a really wonderful partner of this podcast, Hidden Heritage, for this season, and this is one of 2 bonus episodes that we're really excited to share with our listeners, but it's just been really fascinating to hear your incredible in-depth sort of biblical knowledge of the space that you operate and occupy at Charles Russell. So thank you so much for joining us, Katie.
Thank you. No, it's been an absolute privilege. And if any of your listeners want to hear more about the firm Charles Russell Speechlys, our role for landed estates, and particularly on the natural capital journey, we have a Twitter account, on LinkedIn, and our website, charlesrussellspeechlys.com, or just be in touch with me, Katie Talbot, directly.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Molly, for sharing your passion and time with us. You can learn more about the Knepp Estate and the Rewilding project at www.knepp.co.uk. And make sure you also explore the fantastic work CRS are doing for the planet through natural capital by visiting their website, www.charlesrussellspeechlys.com. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you on the next Hidden Heritage podcast.